They thought Emma was just another shy bookworm they could torment without consequences. But when Ashley Parker and her gang slammed that quiet girl against the metal lockers with a sickening crash, they had no idea they'd just awakened someone who'd been trained by a former national judo champion since childhood. What happened next in that crowded hallway would become the most talked about moment in Lincoln Valley High School history, and those bullies would never look at a quiet kid the same way again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had always been the type of person who seemed to disappear into the background, which was exactly how she preferred it. At 16, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into her surroundings, whether it was finding the perfect corner table in the cafeteria or slipping through crowded hallways without drawing attention. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes were carefully chosen to be unremarkable yet clean. She carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from someone who knows exactly who they are, even if the rest of the world hasn't figured it out yet. The move from sunny California to Cedar Falls, Ohio had been jarring in ways that went far beyond the obvious climate change. Everything here felt different from the palm trees and endless summers she'd grown up with. The brick buildings seemed to hunker down against the October chill, and the maple trees that lined the streets of her new neighborhood were already beginning to shed their brilliant red and gold leaves. Her parents' divorce had been finalized just 2 months before the move, and living with her grandfather felt like starting her entire life over from scratch. Sensei Williams, though Emma still struggled to think of him as simply Grandpa, had welcomed her with the same quiet strength that had made him a legend in judo circles decades earlier. His small house on Maple Street was filled with trophies and photographs from his competitive days, though he never talked about them unless directly asked. The basement had been converted into a small dojo years ago, complete with proper mats and mirrors, where he still taught a handful of local students. It was in this space that Emma had spent countless hours over the past 2 months, channeling her frustration and homesickness into perfecting throws and holds that most people twice her age couldn't master. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd moved in with a man who dedicated his life to teaching others how to defend themselves, yet she'd chosen to remain invisible at Lincoln Valley High School. Her grandfather had trained her since she was 8 years old during summer visits, and she'd earned her black belt 3 years ago. But something about starting fresh in a new place had made her want to try being completely ordinary for once. She deliberately left her belt and GI packed away in boxes, never mentioning her background to anyone who asked about hobbies or interests. Lincoln Valley High School was the kind of place that seemed designed to reinforce social hierarchies. Built in the 1980s with long, straight hallways and rows of metal lockers that created perfect echo chambers, it was currently undergoing renovations that made navigation even more challenging. The east wing was blocked off with plastic sheeting and construction noise, forcing everyone to crowd into the remaining corridors between classes. The school's budget cuts had reduced the number of hall monitors, creating pockets of unsupervised chaos that certain students had learned to exploit. It was during her second week at Lincoln Valley that Emma first encountered Ashley Parker and her inner circle. Ashley was the kind of 17-year-old who seemed to have stepped out of a teen movie, with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression of perpetual disdain for anyone she considered beneath her notice. She moved through the hallways with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, surrounded by followers who laughed at her jokes and validated her every opinion. Her 2 closest allies were Megan Torres, a tall brunette whose cruel laugh could cut through any conversation, and Kayla Bennett, who compensated for her smaller stature with an oversized attitude and a talent for finding people's weaknesses. The trio had established themselves as the unofficial queens of Lincoln Valley through a combination of social connections, carefully orchestrated rumors, and an intuitive understanding of teenage psychology. They knew exactly how to identify the students who wouldn't fight back, who had no social protection, and who could be tormented without consequence. They'd perfected their techniques over years of practice, learning to walk the line between outright cruelty and plausible deniability. Emma's first real encounter with Ashley's group happened on a Tuesday morning in late October. She'd been sitting alone in the cafeteria, reading a mystery novel while eating her lunch. When she became aware of someone standing beside her table, the conversation around her had grown quieter, and she could feel other students' eyes turning in her direction. When she looked up, She found Ashley Parker studying her with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. "You're the new girl from California, right?" Ashley's voice carried just enough friendliness to fool any passing teacher, but Emma caught the underlying edge immediately. "I'm Ashley. I basically run the social committee here, and I've been meaning to come introduce myself." Emma marked her place in her book and looked up politely. "I'm Emma. Nice to meet you." "Emma," Ashley repeated as if testing how the name sounded. "That's sweet. Very plain, but sweet. I love your book choice, by the way. Mystery novels are so educational. Really helps you understand how people think, doesn't it?" There was something in Ashley's tone that made Emma's grandfather's training whisper warnings in the back of her mind. Years of studying opponents across judo mats had taught her to read body language and vocal patterns, and everything about Ashley Parker screamed controlled aggression. But this was a cafeteria, not a dojo, and Emma had committed to trying the normal teenage experience. "I've always enjoyed reading," Emma replied carefully, hoping to keep the conversation neutral. Megan Torres chose that moment to join them, sliding into the seat across from Emma without being invited. "Oh, you're the girl who lives with that old man who runs the karate place, right? My mom mentioned something about that when she was gossiping with the neighbors." "It's actually judo," Emma corrected automatically, then immediately regretted giving them any information about her home life. "Judo, karate, whatever," Kayla Bennett added, appearing at Ashley's shoulder like a summoned shadow. "It's all the same weird Asian stuff, right? Does your grandfather make you do all that bowing and meditation nonsense?" Emma felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "He's taught me a lot about discipline and respect." Ashley's smile sharpened. "Discipline and respect. How very traditional. I bet you're one of those kids who does all their homework and never gets in trouble. Am I right?" The question felt like a trap, but Emma couldn't figure out which answer would be safer. She learned long ago that bullies often attacked regardless of how their targets responded, so she decided to stick with honesty. "I try to do well in school." "Of course you do," Ashley said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Well, it's been lovely meeting you, Emma. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of each other." As the three girls walked away, Emma heard Megan's voice carrying back to her table. "God, could she be any more boring? I bet she's never even been to a party." That first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. Ashley and her friends had identified Emma as someone who wouldn't fight back, who had no social connections to protect her, and who could be targeted without fear of retaliation. They began with small things subtle enough to avoid teacher notice. Emma would arrive at her locker to find it slightly ajar, as if someone had been testing the combination. Her textbooks would be mysteriously knocked to the floor when she wasn't looking. During group projects, she'd find herself mysteriously excluded from teams, forcing her to work alone or with whatever other outcasts were available. The psychological warfare escalated as October progressed, and homecoming fever gripped the school. Spirit Week provided perfect cover for Ashley's campaign of targeted harassment. During Pajama Day, Emma arrived in simple flannel pants and a plain t-shirt, only to have Ashley loudly comment about people who don't understand the assignment. When she tried to participate in Color Day by wearing the designated blue, Kayla made sure to mention how some people just don't know how to make colors work for them. The worst part wasn't the comments themselves, but the way other students began to avoid Emma by association. Ashley's social influence was so strong that being seen talking to Emma became a liability. Tyler Jackson, a friendly boy from her English class who'd initially seemed interested in being friends, started looking the other way when they passed in the halls. Ms. Chen, the one teacher who'd shown Emma genuine kindness, seemed increasingly powerless to intervene in situations that technically weren't breaking any rules. Emma found herself spending more and more time in the library, where Ashley's group rarely ventured. The librarian, Mrs. Peterson, was a stern woman who maintained absolute order in her domain, making it one of the few safe spaces in the school. Emma would eat lunch there when she could, hiding among the stacks with her mystery novels and trying to ignore the fact that she was essentially being driven into exile. At home, her grandfather noticed the change in her demeanor, even though she tried to hide it. During their evening training sessions in the basement dojo, he could see the tension in her shoulders. the way she held back her natural aggression even when practicing throws. Sensei Williams had spent 40 years teaching young people, and he recognized the signs of someone being systematically worn down by psychological pressure. "Emma," he said one evening as they finished their cool-down stretches, "you seem troubled lately. Are you finding it difficult to adjust to the new school?" Emma considered lying, but something about her grandfather's patient silence made her want to tell the truth. "There are some girls who don't seem to like me very much. They're not doing anything terrible, just making things difficult." Her grandfather nodded thoughtfully. "In judo, we learn that the strongest stance is often the one that appears most flexible. Sometimes appearing weak can be a form of strength, because it allows you to choose when and how to respond. But there comes a point where patience becomes enabling, and wisdom becomes fear." "I just want to fit in," Emma admitted. "I don't want to be the weird new girl who causes drama." "There is honor in seeking peace," Sensei Williams said quietly. "But there is also honor in standing up for yourself when peace is no longer possible. The techniques I've taught you aren't just for competition or exercise. They're for the moments when walking away is no longer an option." Emma nodded, but she still wasn't ready to abandon her hope that the situation would resolve itself. Ashley and her friends were clearly popular and well-connected, while Emma was still the outsider trying to find her place. She told herself that if she could just make it through the semester, maybe things would get better. Maybe they'd get bored and move on to someone else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She had no way of knowing that Ashley Parker was just getting started, and that the real test of her grandfather's training was still weeks away. The foundation was being laid for a confrontation that would change everything, not just for Emma, but for everyone who'd ever been made to feel small and powerless in the halls of Lincoln Valley High School. The November air was getting colder, and the leaves were mostly gone from the trees now. Emma pulled her jacket tighter as she walked home from school, trying to ignore the feeling that she was being watched. Behind her, she could hear the distant sound of laughter that might have been innocent, but probably wasn't. The real battle was about to begin, and neither side knew just how prepared the other really was. The harassment intensified as November settled over Cedar Falls like a gray blanket. Emma had hoped that Ashley and her crew would eventually lose interest, but instead, they seemed energized by her lack of response. What had started as subtle psychological warfare was evolving into something more deliberate and cruel, as if Emma's refusal to break was actually making them more determined to find her breaking point. The escalation began during gym class on the first Monday of November. Lincoln Valley High required all students to participate in physical education, and Emma had been dreading it since her first day. The gymnasium was exactly the kind of environment where Ashley's influence was strongest, and Coach Martinez seemed to operate under the old-school belief that whatever happened during class was just kids being kids. Emma had been doing her best to stay invisible during volleyball rotations, positioning herself in the back row where she could participate without drawing attention. She'd actually been enjoying the game more than expected, her years of judo training giving her better reflexes and coordination than most of her classmates realized. But her competence became a problem when her team started winning consistently, and Ashley's team found themselves on the losing side. "Lucky shot," Ashley called out after Emma managed a particularly good serve that scored a point. There was an edge to her voice that made several nearby students glance over nervously. Emma rotated to the front row for the next play, focusing on the game and trying to ignore the growing tension. When the ball came her way, she executed a perfect spike that caught Ashley's team completely off guard. The gymnasium erupted in cheers from Emma's teammates, but she could see Ashley's face darkening with anger. "Beginner's luck," Megan Torres muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just get lucky when they're trying to show off." Coach Martinez blew his whistle to rotate positions, and Emma moved to the back row again. As the teams switched sides, Ashley deliberately bumped into Emma's shoulder, making it look accidental to anyone watching casually. "Watch where you're going, newbie," she said with false sweetness. Emma steadied herself and continued to her position, but she could feel the familiar knot of tension forming in her stomach. Her grandfather's training had taught her to recognize the signs of an impending confrontation, and everything about Ashley's body language screamed escalation. The other students seemed to sense it too, their conversations becoming more hushed as they watched the drama unfold. The next play was a disaster waiting to happen. When the ball came over the net, Emma positioned herself to return it, but Ashley charged forward from her position and deliberately collided with Emma at full speed. They both went down hard, Emma's shoulder hitting the gymnasium floor with an impact that knocked the wind out of her lungs. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Ashley exclaimed, her voice carrying perfectly to where Coach Martinez was standing. "I was trying to get the ball, and I didn't see you there. Are you okay?" Emma struggled to catch her breath, her shoulder throbbing where it had hit the polished wood floor. Around them, students were gathering in a circle, some genuinely concerned, but others clearly excited by the potential for drama. She could see Ashley's satisfied smirk quickly replaced by a mask of fake concern as the coach approached. "Rodriguez, Parker, you both okay?" Coach Martinez asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather not deal with any paperwork. That looked like a pretty good collision. "I'm fine, Coach," Ashley said quickly, bouncing to her feet with theatrical energy. "Just got a little too enthusiastic about the game. Emma, are you hurt?" Emma sat up slowly, testing her shoulder and trying to assess the damage. It was sore, but not seriously injured, and she could tell that Ashley had been careful to make the collision look accidental while still delivering maximum impact. "I'm okay," she said quietly, accepting Tyler Jackson's offered hand to help her stand. "Good, good," Coach Martinez said, already losing interest. "Let's keep playing. Accidents happen in sports, that's just part of the game." But Emma could see in Ashley's eyes that this had been no accident. It was a test, a way of seeing how far she could push before Emma would finally push back. And when Emma simply returned to her position without complaint or retaliation, Ashley's smile became predatory. The pattern continued throughout the week. Ashley would find ways to make Emma's life miserable that were subtle enough to avoid official notice but obvious enough to establish her dominance. During chemistry lab, she would accidentally bump Emma's workstation, causing carefully measured solutions to spill. In the hallways, she would position herself so that Emma had to squeeze past groups of students, making her feel like she was constantly apologizing for existing. The psychological aspect was perhaps more damaging than the physical harassment. Ashley had begun recruiting other students to participate in her campaign, not through direct orders, but through the subtle social pressure that she wielded like a weapon. Students who might have been friendly to Emma began avoiding her, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Those who were already part of Ashley's orbit started treating Emma with the same disdain, creating an ever-widening circle of isolation. Emma found herself eating lunch in the library every day now, the cafeteria having become too hostile an environment to navigate. Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, had begun nodding at her with what might have been sympathy, but she never intervened directly. The unspoken rule at Lincoln Valley seemed to be that students were expected to handle their own social problems, and adults would only step in if there was clear evidence of physical violence or academic disruption. At home, Emma's grandfather continued to notice the changes in her behavior. During their evening training sessions, he could see that she was holding back, restraining herself even during practice. Her technique remained flawless, but there was no heart behind it, no fire in her movements. She was going through the motions of judo without engaging the mental discipline that made it effective. "Emma," Sensei Williams said one evening as they finished practicing throws, "you are technically perfect, but you are fighting like someone who has already surrendered. In competition, this would make you vulnerable to opponents who might be less skilled, but more committed." Emma sat on the edge of the mat, toweling off the sweat from their session. "I just don't want to hurt anyone, Grandpa. The techniques you've taught me are meant for self-defense, not for attacking people who are just being mean." Her grandfather sat beside her, his weathered hands folded in his lap. There is wisdom in restraint, but there is also wisdom in knowing when restraint becomes cowardice. I have been teaching judo for 40 years, and I have seen many students struggle with this balance. The art is not just about the physical techniques, it is about understanding when and how to use them. "But what if I'm wrong?" Emma asked. "What if I hurt someone and it turns out I could have solved the problem some other way? What if you don't defend yourself and someone gets hurt anyway?" Her grandfather replied. "What if your restraint enables someone else to become a victim? Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is to show a bully that their behavior has consequences." Emma nodded, but she still wasn't ready to abandon her hope that the situation would resolve itself peacefully. She had been raised to believe that violence was always the last resort, and she couldn't shake the feeling that using her training against high school bullies would somehow be an abuse of power. What she didn't know was that Ashley Parker was about to make that choice for her. The incident that would change everything began on a Wednesday morning in mid-November. Emma arrived at school to find her locker vandalized with permanent marker, cruel words scrawled across the metal surface in Ashley's distinctive handwriting. The janitor, Mr. Foster, was already there with cleaning supplies, shaking his head as he scrubbed at the graffiti. "I'm sorry about this, Emma," he said quietly. "I've reported it to the office, but between you and me, I don't think they're going to do much about it. No cameras in this hallway, and it'll be your word against whoever did it." Emma stared at the harsh words that had been written about her, feeling something shift inside her chest. The graffiti was crude and personal, attacking not just her appearance but her family situation and her grandfather's ethnicity. Someone had taken time to research her background and craft insults designed to cut as deeply as possible. "Thank you for cleaning it up," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate it." Mr. Foster paused in his scrubbing and looked at her with concern. "You know, Emma, I've been working at this school for 15 years, and I've seen this kind of thing before. Sometimes the administration can't help, but that doesn't mean you have to handle it alone. There are people here who care about what happens to you." Emma nodded, but she could see that even his kindness was limited by the reality of his position. Mr. Foster was a janitor, not a teacher or counselor, and his influence over student behavior was essentially non-existent. She gathered her books and headed to first period, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed her down the hallway. The day only got worse from there. During English class, Emma discovered that someone had torn pages out of her copy of the assigned reading, making it impossible for her to follow along with the discussion. In history, she found a note in her backpack that contained more of the same cruel language that had been on her locker. By lunchtime, she was exhausted from the constant vigilance required to navigate Ashley's psychological warfare. She was sitting in her usual spot in the library, trying to eat her sandwich while reading, when Tyler Jackson approached her table. He looked nervous, glancing around as if he was afraid of being seen talking to her. "Hey, Emma," he said quietly, sliding into the chair across from her. "I wanted to talk to you about something." Emma looked up from her book, surprised by the first genuinely friendly interaction she'd had all day. "What's up?" Tyler hesitated, then leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Look, I know what's been happening to you and I feel terrible about it. Ashley and her friends have been spreading rumors and making your life hell, and I just want you to know that not everyone believes they're garbage." "Thank you," Emma said, genuinely touched by his concern. "That means a lot. But here's the thing," Tyler continued, his expression growing more serious. "I heard them talking after gym class yesterday, and they're planning something bigger. I don't know exactly what, but Ashley was saying something about teaching you a lesson that everyone would remember." Emma felt her stomach drop. "What kind of lesson?" "I don't know the details, but it's supposed to happen after school today. They were talking about the main hallway, near the lockers by the front entrance. I think they're planning to humiliate you in front of as many people as possible." Emma stared at him, processing this information. Part of her was grateful for the warning, but another part of her was tired of living in fear of what Ashley might do next. "Why are you telling me this?" Tyler looked uncomfortable. "Because it's wrong, and because I should have said something sooner. I've been afraid of becoming a target myself, but that's not an excuse for letting this continue. What do you think I should do?" "I think you should tell a teacher, or maybe go home sick today. Avoid the confrontation entirely. Ashley's looking for a reaction, and if you're not there to give her one, maybe she'll finally get bored and move on." Emma nodded, but even as she thanked Tyler for the warning, she knew she wasn't going to run away. Something about the vandalized locker, the torn book pages, and the cruel notes had crystallized her resolve. She was tired of being driven into hiding, tired of letting Ashley control her movements and choices. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is to show a bully that their behavior has consequences. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Emma found herself paying attention to details she'd never noticed before. The layout of the hallways, the timing of class changes, the locations of the security cameras. Her grandfather's training was asserting itself despite her conscious reluctance, her mind automatically cataloging potential advantages and disadvantages of different locations and scenarios. When the final bell rang, Emma made her way toward the front entrance, instead of heading to her usual exit. She could have taken Tyler's advice and avoided the confrontation entirely, but something inside her had reached its limit. She was done being afraid, done living like a prisoner in her own school. The main hallway was crowded with students heading home for the day, their voices echoing off the metal lockers and polished floors. Emma could see Ashley and her crew positioned strategically near the front entrance, exactly where Tyler had warned her they would be. They were pretending to have a casual conversation, but Emma could see the tension in their posture, the way they were watching for her approach. As she walked toward them, Emma felt a strange calm settle over her. All the anxiety and fear of the past weeks seemed to drain away, replaced by the focused awareness that her grandfather had taught her to cultivate. She could see every detail of the scene unfolding before her. The other students who were slowing down to watch, the way Ashley's eyes lit up when she spotted Emma approaching, the subtle repositioning of Megan and Kayla to block potential escape routes. "Well, well," Ashley said loudly, her voice carrying over the general noise of the hallway. "Look who decided to show up after all. I was starting to think you were too scared to face us." Emma stopped a few feet away from them, close enough to talk but far enough to maintain some distance. Around them, other students were beginning to notice the confrontation, their conversations dying down as they sensed the potential for drama. "I'm not scared of you, Ashley," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. "I'm just tired of your games." Ashley's smile widened, and Emma realized that this was exactly the response she'd been hoping for. "Games? I don't know what you're talking about. I've been nothing but nice to you since you got here." "Writing on my locker isn't nice," Emma replied. "Destroying my books isn't nice. Spreading rumors about my family isn't nice." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Ashley said with exaggerated innocence. "Maybe you're just paranoid. Maybe you're looking for attention. Maybe you're just trying to make yourself seem important by blaming other people for your problems." The crowd around them was growing larger, and Emma could see students pulling out their phones to record what was happening. This was exactly what Ashley had wanted, a public stage where she could demonstrate her power and Emma's helplessness. "I just want to be left alone," Emma said, making one last attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Oh, but that's not how high school works," Ashley replied, taking a step closer. "You can't just ignore people and expect them to ignore you back. You can't just walk around here like you're better than everyone else." "I never said I was better than anyone." "You didn't have to say it. It's obvious from the way you act. Too good to talk to people, too good to participate in school activities, too good to make friends. Well, maybe it's time someone taught you that you're not special." Emma could see what was about to happen before it started. Ashley's body language had shifted into attack mode, and Megan and Kayla were moving to flank her. The crowd had formed a rough circle around them, creating a natural arena for whatever was about to unfold. "I think," Ashley said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that you need to learn some respect." That's when she made her move, lunging forward with her hands outstretched to grab Emma's shoulders. But this time, Emma was ready. This time, she wasn't going to be the victim of someone else's story. The moment Ashley's hands made contact with her shoulders, Emma's training took over completely. Time seemed to slow as she stepped back and to the side, using Ashley's momentum against her. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. "In judo, you don't fight force with force. You redirect it." Ashley's forward momentum carried her past Emma, and she stumbled slightly as she found herself grabbing at empty air. The crowd gasped, but Emma wasn't finished. As Ashley tried to regain her balance, Emma grabbed her wrist and executed a perfect hip throw that sent the older girl flying through the air. Ashley hit the floor hard, her back slamming against the polished linoleum with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. For a moment, she lay there stunned, staring up at the ceiling as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. The hallway erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Students who had been expecting to see Emma humiliated were instead witnessing something they never could have imagined. Quiet, bookish Emma Rodriguez had just thrown Ashley Parker across the hallway like she weighed nothing. Megan Torres recovered first, her face twisting with rage as she rushed toward Emma. "You little freak, you're gonna pay for that." But Emma was ready for her too. As Megan reached for her, Emma caught her wrist and twisted, applying a joint lock that sent Megan to her knees with a cry of pain. It was a technique designed to control without causing permanent damage, but the effect was immediate and dramatic. Kayla Bennett tried to grab Emma from behind, but Emma had been aware of her position throughout the entire confrontation. She ducked under Kayla's reaching arms and swept her legs, sending the third bully sprawling across the floor to land in a heap next to her friends. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the hallway was now completely silent except for the groans of Ashley's crew as they struggled to get back to their feet. Emma stood in the center of the circle, breathing slightly harder than normal but otherwise appearing completely composed. Around her, students stared in amazement at the quiet new girl who had just dismantled the school's most feared bullies with what looked like effortless precision. Phones were recording from every angle, and Emma knew that by tomorrow morning, everyone in Cedar Falls would know what had happened in the hallway of Lincoln Valley High School. Ashley struggled to her feet, her face flushed with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over," she wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Emma. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Emma looked at her calmly, no longer the frightened victim who had endured weeks of torment. "No, Ashley. The mistake was yours. You picked the wrong person to mess with." As teachers arrived to break up the crowd and sort out what had happened, Emma walked calmly toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting, stories of how the quiet new girl had taken down Ashley Parker and her entire crew single-handedly. The aftermath was swift and decisive, though not in the way Emma had expected. Within minutes of the confrontation, Principal Davis was striding down the hallway with the authoritative gait of someone accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. His weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene. Ashley Parker still on the floor holding her back, Megan Torres cradling her wrist, Kayla Bennett trying to untangle herself from the heap she'd landed in, and Emma standing calmly in the center of it all while dozens of students recorded everything on their phones. "Everyone put your phones away now," Principal Davis commanded, his voice cutting through the excited chatter. "Anyone who doesn't comply will be suspended for violating the school's recording policy. Move along to your buses or cars, this is not a spectator event." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, though Emma could see students continuing to film discreetly from greater distances. The story was already spreading through social media, and she knew there was no stopping it now. Tyler Jackson caught her eye from across the hallway and gave her a subtle thumbs up before disappearing into the crowd. "Miss Rodriguez, Miss Parker, Miss Torres, Miss Bennett," Principal Davis said formally. "My office, immediately. Nurse Henderson will check you all for injuries first." The walk to the nurse's office felt surreal to Emma. She moved through the familiar hallways as if seeing them for the first time, hyper-aware of every whispered conversation and stolen glance from students who were still processing what they'd witnessed. Ashley limped slightly as she walked. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Megan held her wrist gingerly, shooting venomous looks at Emma when she thought no one was watching. Kayla remained silent, her usual bravado replaced by obvious confusion about how their carefully planned humiliation had gone so spectacularly wrong. Nurse Henderson was a practical woman in her 50s, who had seen every kind of teenage drama imaginable during her 20 years at Lincoln Valley. She examined each girl methodically, checking for serious injuries while maintaining the professional neutrality that her position required. Ashley's back was bruised but not damaged, Megan's wrist was sore but not sprained, and Kayla had scraped her knee when she fell but was otherwise unharmed. Emma showed no signs of injury at all. "Well," Nurse Henderson said as she finished her examinations, "nobody needs immediate medical attention, but I'll be calling all your parents to inform them of what happened and to recommend follow-up visits to your family doctors if any pain persists." Emma felt her stomach clench at the mention of calling parents. Her grandfather was going to find out about this, and she wasn't sure how he would react to learning that she'd used her judo training in a high school hallway fight. She'd spent months hiding from conflict, and now she'd created the biggest spectacle Lincoln Valley had seen all year. Principal Davis's office was a study in bureaucratic efficiency, with filing cabinets lining the walls and motivational posters that looked like they'd been purchased in bulk from an educational supply catalog. He gestured for the 4 girls to sit in the chairs arranged in front of his desk, then settled into his own chair with the weary expression of someone who'd had this conversation too many times before. "I've already spoken to several witnesses," he began, pulling out a thick folder and opening it on his desk. "The story seems to be consistent across multiple accounts. Miss Parker, Miss Torres, and Miss Bennett approached Miss Rodriguez in the main hallway. There was a verbal confrontation that escalated to physical contact. Miss Rodriguez then used what appears to be martial arts training to defend herself against all 3 of you." Ashley straightened in her chair, wincing slightly from her bruised back. "Principal Davis, you have to understand, we were just trying to talk to her. She completely overreacted and attacked us for no reason. We're the victims here." "Is that your version of events?" Principal Davis asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Absolutely," Ashley continued, her voice gaining strength as she settled into her familiar role as the wronged party. "We approached Emma to try to include her in homecoming activities, and she just snapped and started throwing us around like we were punching bags. It was completely unprovoked." Megan nodded vigorously, though the movement made her wince and clutch her wrist. "She's been acting weird since she got here. We were just trying to be friendly, and she turned violent on us. I think she might have anger management issues." Principal Davis turned to Emma, his expression unreadable. "Miss Rodriguez, what's your account of what happened?" Emma took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "They've been harassing me for weeks. They vandalized my locker, destroyed my books, and spread rumors about my family. Today they cornered me in the hallway and demanded that I show them respect. When Ashley grabbed my shoulders and tried to push me, I defended myself." "That's a lie!" Kayla burst out, speaking for the first time since they had arrived at the office. "We never vandalized anything or spread rumors. She's making it all up to justify attacking us." Principal Davis held up a hand for silence, then pulled out several sheets of paper from his folder. "Actually, Miss Bennett, I've had several students come forward in the past hour with information about ongoing harassment. It seems that Miss Rodriguez's account is corroborated by multiple witnesses who were afraid to speak up before now." Emma blinked in surprise. She had no idea that other students had been paying attention to Ashley's campaign against her, much less that they would be willing to report it to the administration. "Furthermore," Principal Davis continued, "Mr. Foster reported the vandalism of Miss Rodriguez's locker earlier today, and we have security camera footage from the hallway showing Miss Parker in the area during the time frame when it occurred." Ashley's face went pale. "That doesn't prove anything. I walk through that hallway every day. The footage shows you stopping at Miss Rodriguez's locker and appearing to write something on it," Principal Davis replied calmly. "Mr. Foster also preserved photographs of the graffiti before cleaning it up, and the handwriting has been compared to samples from your school assignments." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Emma realized that the adults at Lincoln Valley had been paying more attention than she'd thought, even if they hadn't intervened directly. Principal Davis had been building a case, waiting for the right moment to act. "Now," Principal Davis said, leaning back in his chair, "let's discuss consequences. Miss Parker, Miss Torres, and Miss Bennett, you are suspended for 5 days for harassment, vandalism, and initiating a physical altercation. Your parents have been contacted and are on their way to collect you. You will also be required to attend counseling sessions about bullying and conflict resolution before you can return to school." Ashley's composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous. We're the ones who got hurt. She's the one who should be suspended. Miss Rodriguez was defending herself against a 3-on-1 attack that you initiated," Principal Davis replied firmly. "However, Miss Rodriguez, the use of martial arts training in a school setting is a serious matter. While I understand that you were defending yourself, the level of force you used was significantly greater than what your attackers employed." Emma felt her heart sink. Despite everything, she was still going to be punished for defending herself. "Therefore," Principal Davis continued, "you will serve 1 day of in-school suspension to reflect on alternative methods of conflict resolution. You will also be required to meet with the school counselor to discuss appropriate use of your martial arts training. However, I want to be clear that this is not a punishment for defending yourself, but rather an educational opportunity to explore other options that might have been available. Emma nodded, relief flooding through her. One day of in-school suspension was essentially nothing compared to what Ashley and her crew were facing. Additionally, Principal Davis said, his tone becoming more serious, I understand that Miss Rodriguez has been training in judo for several years under the instruction of a former competitive champion. Miss Rodriguez, why didn't you report this harassment to school officials earlier? Emma considered the question carefully. I was trying to handle it myself, sir. My grandfather taught me that violence should always be the last resort, and I kept hoping the situation would resolve itself without anyone getting hurt. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man, Principal Davis said with what might have been approval. However, our school has resources available to help students deal with harassment before it escalates to physical confrontation. In the future, I hope you'll feel comfortable coming to us sooner. The meeting concluded with paperwork and phone calls to parents. Emma sat in the outer office waiting for her grandfather to arrive, watching as Ashley, Megan, and Kayla were collected by increasingly angry-looking adults. Ashley's mother looked exactly like an older version of her daughter, with the same blonde hair and entitled expression, and she was clearly preparing to fight the suspension decision. Megan's father appeared to be a large, intimidating man who looked embarrassed by his daughter's behavior. Kayla's parents seemed more concerned with making sure she wasn't seriously injured than with understanding what had happened. When Sensei Williams arrived, Emma was struck by how calm and dignified he appeared compared to the other parents. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, his gray hair neatly combed, and he moved with the same controlled grace that he brought to everything he did. He listened carefully as Principal Davis explained the situation, asking thoughtful questions and nodding at appropriate moments. I appreciate the school's handling of this matter, he said when Principal Davis finished his explanation. Emma has been taught to use her skills responsibly, but I understand that the school environment presents unique challenges. We will discuss this incident thoroughly at home. The drive home was quiet at first, with Emma staring out the window at the familiar streets of Cedar Falls while her grandfather navigated the afternoon traffic. She was dreading the conversation she knew was coming, but she was also curious about his reaction. He didn't seem angry, but she couldn't quite read his expression. Emma, he finally said as they pulled into their driveway, tell me what happened today. Not the official version, but what really happened. Emma took a deep breath and told him everything. The weeks of harassment, the vandalized locker, the destroyed books, the confrontation in the hallway, and the moment when she'd finally decided she wasn't going to be a victim anymore. Her grandfather listened without interruption, occasionally nodding but never expressing judgment about her choices. I'm sorry, Grandpa, she said when she finished her account. I know you taught me that violence should be the last resort, but I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to handle it peacefully, but they just kept escalating. Sensei Williams was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap as he considered her words. Emma, do you remember what I told you about the difference between aggression and self-defense? You said that aggression is about imposing your will on others, but self-defense is about protecting yourself and others when peaceful solutions aren't possible. That's correct. And do you believe that you were defending yourself today? Emma thought about the question carefully. Yes, sir. They cornered me and put their hands on me first. I tried to talk my way out of it, but they weren't going to let me leave. Then you made the right choice, her grandfather said simply. You showed restraint for weeks, trying to resolve the situation peacefully. When that was no longer possible, you defended yourself with appropriate force. You didn't seriously injure anyone, and you stopped as soon as the threat was neutralized. That is exactly what I have been training you to do. Emma felt tears of relief welling up in her eyes. I was so afraid you'd be disappointed in me. I am proud of you, Sensei Williams said firmly. You showed wisdom, restraint, and courage. But more importantly, you stood up for yourself when no one else would. That takes a special kind of strength. That evening, Emma's phone began buzzing with messages from classmates she'd barely spoken to before. The videos of her confrontation with Ashley's crew had spread throughout the school's social media networks, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the quiet girl who turned out to be a martial arts expert. Tyler Jackson sent her a long message congratulating her and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Even some of Ashley's former followers were reaching out, apparently eager to distance themselves from their disgraced leader. The response wasn't universally positive. Some students criticized Emma for using excessive force, arguing that she should have found another way to handle the situation. Others suggested that she'd been planning the confrontation all along, deliberately hiding her abilities until she could maximize the damage to Ashley's reputation. But for every negative comment, there were 5 or 6 messages of support from students who'd apparently been waiting for someone to stand up to Ashley Parker. Emma was particularly touched by a message from Maria Santos, a sophomore who'd been one of Ashley's targets the previous year. "Thank you for showing everyone that bullies aren't invincible," Maria wrote. "I wish I had been brave enough to fight back when it was happening to me, but I'm so glad you were." The next morning, Emma arrived at school to find that everything had changed. Students who had previously avoided her now smiled and nodded as she passed in the hallways. Teachers who'd barely acknowledged her existence suddenly knew her name and asked how she was doing. The atmosphere at Lincoln Valley felt different somehow, as if Ashley's public humiliation had lifted a cloud of fear that had been hanging over the entire school. Emma's day of in-school suspension turned out to be surprisingly productive. She spent the morning in the school library working on assignments while reflecting on the events of the previous day. Mrs. Peterson, the librarian, brought her a cup of coffee and a homemade muffin, mentioning casually that she'd been hoping someone would stand up to Ashley Parker for years. "You know," Mrs. Peterson said as she arranged books on a nearby shelf, "I've been working in schools for 30 years, and I've learned that sometimes the quiet ones are the strongest ones. They just choose their battles more carefully." During lunch, Emma was surprised to find Tyler Jackson and several other students sitting at her usual table in the library. They'd brought their lunches and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her better, asking about her judo training and her life in California. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln Valley, Emma felt like she might actually belong somewhere. The meeting with the school counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, turned out to be more of a conversation than a lecture. Ms. Rodriguez was a young woman who'd clearly dealt with bullying situations before, and she seemed genuinely interested in understanding Emma's perspective on what had happened. "I've read the reports and watched the security footage," Ms. Rodriguez said as they sat in her comfortable office. "I have to say, your restraint was remarkable. Most people in your situation would have either run away or escalated much sooner." "My grandfather taught me to always look for peaceful solutions first," Emma explained. "I really didn't want to hurt anyone." "But you also recognized when peaceful solutions were no longer viable," Ms. Rodriguez observed. "That shows excellent judgment. However, I want to make sure you understand that there are resources available here at school that might help in similar situations in the future." They discussed various strategies for dealing with harassment, from documenting incidents to involving trusted adults to using peer mediation services. Emma appreciated the information, though she suspected that her reputation would protect her from future bullying attempts more effectively than any official intervention. When Emma returned to regular classes the following day, she was amazed by how dramatically the social dynamics at Lincoln Valley had shifted. Ashley Parker was still serving her suspension, but her absence seemed to have created a power vacuum that no one was eager to fill. Students who'd been afraid to speak up before were now openly discussing their own experiences with bullying, and several teacher-led discussions about respect and conflict resolution had been spontaneously organized. Emma found herself in the unexpected position of being something of a celebrity. Students she'd never met knew her name and wanted to hear about her judo training. Several people asked if she was planning to start a martial arts club at school, and a few younger students mentioned that they were thinking about taking self-defense classes. The attention was overwhelming at first, but Emma gradually learned to navigate her new social status. She made it clear that she wasn't interested in becoming a vigilante or fighting other people's battles, but she was happy to talk about the mental discipline and confidence that martial arts training had given her. She began eating lunch in the cafeteria again, surrounded by a growing group of friends who seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. Ashley Parker returned to school the following Monday, but the queen who'd once ruled Lincoln Valley High with an iron fist was gone. In her place was a sullen, defensive teenager who avoided eye contact and spoke only when directly addressed. Her former followers had scattered to other social groups, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association with someone who'd been so publicly humiliated. Emma occasionally caught Ashley staring at her from across the cafeteria or in the hallways, but there was no longer any threat in those looks. If anything, Ashley seemed almost afraid of her, as if she couldn't quite believe that the quiet girl she'd tormented for weeks had turned out to be capable of such decisive action. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Emma was walking home from school when she noticed Ashley sitting alone on a bench in the small park near the downtown area. She looked smaller somehow, hunched in on herself in a way that made Emma think of how she herself had felt during those first weeks at Lincoln Valley. Without really thinking about it, Emma found herself walking over to the bench. "Ashley," she said quietly, causing the other girl to look up with startled eyes. "What do you want?" Ashley asked, her voice lacking its usual venom. Emma sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving plenty of space between them. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened." "Come to gloat?" Ashley's attempt at sarcasm fell flat, sounding more tired than angry. "No," Emma said simply. "I wanted to understand why you felt like you needed to make my life miserable. I never did anything to you." Ashley was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that Emma had to lean forward to hear her. "You reminded me of everything I used to be," Ashley said finally. "Before I learned how to be popular, before I figured out how to make people afraid of disappointing me. You were smart and confident without needing anyone else's approval, and I hated that about you." Emma considered this confession, trying to reconcile it with the cruel, calculating person who'd made her life hell for weeks. "So you decided to tear me down instead of building yourself up? I thought if I could break you, it would prove that my way was better, that being popular and feared was stronger than being smart and independent." Ashley laughed bitterly. "I guess I was wrong about that." "You could try being yourself again," Emma suggested. "People might like the real you better than the person you've been pretending to be." Ashley looked at her with something that might have been hope. "Do you really think so?" "I think it's worth finding out," Emma replied. "But it starts with deciding who you want to be, not who you think other people want you to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes before Ashley stood up to leave. "Emma," she said as she gathered her backpack, "I'm really sorry for everything I did to you. You didn't deserve any of it." "Thank you," Emma said. "That means a lot." As Ashley walked away, Emma reflected on how much had changed since that first day at Lincoln Valley High School. She'd arrived as a scared, lonely girl trying to hide from her own strength, and somehow she'd found the courage to stand up for herself when it mattered most. More importantly, she'd learned that being true to yourself was more powerful than any martial arts technique. Her grandfather had been right about choosing your battles wisely, but he'd also been right about standing up for yourself when walking away was no longer an option. Sometimes the quiet ones really were the strongest ones, not because they sought conflict, but because they'd learned when conflict was necessary. Emma pulled out her phone to text her grandfather that she'd be home soon for their evening training session. For the first time since moving to Cedar Falls, she was looking forward to tomorrow. 3 months had passed since the hallway confrontation that changed everything at Lincoln Valley High School, and Emma Rodriguez could barely recognize the person she'd been when she first walked through those doors. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but rather through a series of small moments that gradually built into something larger than she'd ever imagined possible. The most immediate change was in her daily routine. Where she'd once eaten lunch alone in the library, hiding behind mystery novels and hoping to remain invisible, Emma now found herself at the center of a diverse group of friends who genuinely enjoyed her company. Tyler Jackson had become her closest confidant, the boy who'd warned her about Ashley's planned confrontation having proven himself to be loyal and trustworthy. Maria Santos, the sophomore who'd thanked Emma for standing up to bullies, had become like a younger sister, often seeking advice about everything from homework to family problems. But perhaps the most surprising addition to Emma's social circle was David Chen, Ms. Chen's nephew, and a senior who'd transferred to Lincoln Valley from a private school in Columbus. David was a quiet, thoughtful student who'd been homeschooled for most of his life and was struggling to adapt to the complex social dynamics of public high school. He'd approached Emma one day in the library, explaining that he'd heard about her situation and wanted to learn more about martial arts as a way of building confidence. "I've never been in a fight in my life," David confessed during one of their conversations. I've always been the type to avoid conflict entirely, but watching how you handled Ashley and her friends made me realize that sometimes avoiding conflict just makes you a target. Emma had been hesitant to take on any kind of mentoring role, but something about David's earnest desire to improve himself reminded her of her own journey. She'd suggested that he visit her grandfather's dojo, not necessarily to learn how to fight, but to understand the mental discipline that made physical confrontation unnecessary most of the time. Sensei Williams had welcomed David with the same patient kindness he showed all his students, and within a few weeks, the shy transfer student was beginning to carry himself with more confidence. He wasn't learning judo to hurt anyone, but rather to understand his own capabilities and limitations. The change in his posture and demeanor was remarkable, and Emma found herself proud of the small role she'd played in his transformation. The ripple effects of that November confrontation had spread far beyond Emma's immediate circle of friends. Ashley Parker's fall from social dominance had created a power vacuum that, surprisingly, no one seemed eager to fill. Instead of another queen bee rising to take her place, Lincoln Valley had settled into a more egalitarian social structure, where different groups coexisted without the constant threat of harassment from above. Ashley herself had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone. After their conversation in the park, she'd begun the slow process of rebuilding her reputation and relationships. It hadn't been easy. Many students were suspicious of her apparent change of heart, wondering if it was just another manipulation. But Ashley had persisted, joining the volunteer tutoring program and helping younger students with their homework, participating in community service projects, and gradually proving that her apology to Emma had been genuine. Emma watched this transformation with a mixture of skepticism and hope. She'd learned not to trust Ashley completely, but she also recognized the courage it took to abandon a successful social strategy and try to become a better person. When Ashley approached her in early February to ask if she'd be willing to speak at an anti-bullying assembly that the student council was organizing, Emma had been surprised by the request. "I know I'm probably the last person who should be asking you this," Ashley had said, her voice lacking any of the calculated charm that had once made her so popular. "But the counselors think it would be powerful if we could get someone to talk about the victim's perspective, and honestly, you're the only person I know who successfully stood up for themselves." Emma had agreed, though the idea of speaking in front of the entire school made her nervous in a way that physical confrontation never had. Public speaking required a different kind of courage than judo, and she'd spent weeks preparing her remarks with help from her grandfather and Ms. Rodriguez, the school counselor. The assembly itself had been held on a gray Friday morning in February, with the entire student body packed into the gymnasium where Emma had once been deliberately collided with during volleyball. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, Emma had felt the same focused calm that came over her during judo competitions. She'd spoken about the importance of recognizing harassment early, the value of seeking help from trusted adults, and the difference between self-defense and revenge. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," she'd told the assembled students. "I spent weeks trying to find a peaceful solution because that's what I'd been taught was right. But I also learned that sometimes peace isn't possible when you're dealing with people who view your kindness as weakness. The goal isn't to become someone who looks for fights, but to become someone who can defend themselves when fights become unavoidable." The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with several students approaching her afterward to share their own experiences with bullying and to thank her for speaking up. Principal Davis had commended her presentation, and even some teachers who'd previously seemed oblivious to the harassment problem had begun paying closer attention to student interactions. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from Ashley herself, who'd approached Emma after the assembly with tears in her eyes. "I never really understood how much damage I was doing," she'd said quietly. "Hearing you describe what it felt like to be targeted like that. I'm so sorry, Emma. I know I've said it before, but I really mean it." Emma had accepted the apology, and over the following weeks, she and Ashley had developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was definitely mutual respect. They'd never be close, but they'd found a way to coexist peacefully, and Emma occasionally found herself offering advice when Ashley struggled with her efforts to rebuild her social relationships. The spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. Emma had been elected to the student council, partly because of her reputation for standing up to injustice, and partly because her fellow students recognized her natural leadership abilities. She'd also been approached by the school administration about starting a conflict resolution program, where students could receive training in de-escalation techniques and peer mediation. The program had launched in March with Emma and David as the founding members, joined by Tyler, Maria, and, surprisingly, Ashley. The group met twice a week after school, learning techniques for managing conflict before it escalated to physical confrontation. They practiced active listening, empathy exercises, and strategies for identifying the underlying causes of interpersonal problems. Sensei Williams had volunteered to provide some training sessions, teaching the group about the mental discipline required for effective conflict resolution. In judo, he'd explained during one of their meetings, we learn to read our opponent's intentions and energy. The same skills can be applied to understanding when someone is acting out of fear, anger, or pain rather than genuine malice. The program had been so successful that other schools in the district had begun asking for information about how to implement similar initiatives. Emma found herself invited to speak at conferences and workshops, sharing her story and the lessons she'd learned about standing up for yourself, while also working to prevent conflicts from escalating unnecessarily. As spring turned to summer, Emma reflected on how much her life had changed since that first day at Lincoln Valley High School. She'd arrived as a scared, lonely girl trying to hide from her own strength, and she was finishing her junior year as a confident young woman who'd learned to balance assertiveness with compassion. Her relationship with her grandfather had deepened as well. Their evening training sessions had evolved from simple technique practice to philosophical discussions about the application of martial arts principles to everyday life. Sensei Williams had begun treating her more like a fellow instructor than a student, occasionally asking for her input on teaching strategies for his other pupils. You have learned the most important lesson, he told her one evening as they finished their workout. Strength without wisdom is dangerous, but wisdom without strength is powerless. You have found the balance between them. Emma's academic performance had improved dramatically as well. Without the constant stress of harassment and social anxiety, she'd been able to focus on her studies in a way that hadn't been possible during those first difficult months. Her grades had climbed from barely acceptable to genuinely excellent, and several teachers had begun encouraging her to consider applying to competitive colleges. The summer before her senior year, Emma had been invited to attend a leadership camp specifically designed for students who'd overcome significant challenges. The camp brought together teenagers from across the country who'd demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity, and Emma found herself inspired by their stories of triumph over everything from poverty to disability to family dysfunction. During one of the camp's discussion sessions, Emma had shared her own story of transformation from victim to advocate. A girl from Arizona who'd been dealing with cyberbullying had approached her afterward, asking for advice about how to stand up for herself without resorting to the kind of online retaliation that had made her situation worse. The thing I learned, Emma had told her, is that you can't control other people's behavior, but you can control your response to it. Sometimes that means walking away, sometimes it means seeking help from adults, and sometimes it means standing your ground. The key is knowing which response is appropriate for each situation. These conversations had crystallized something in Emma's mind about her future plans. She'd always been a good student with vague ideas about college and career, but her experiences at Lincoln Valley had given her a sense of purpose that she'd never had before. She wanted to work with young people who were struggling with bullying and social anxiety, helping them find their own strength and confidence. When she returned to Cedar Falls for her senior year, Emma had decided to pursue a degree in psychology with a focus on adolescent development and conflict resolution. She'd begun researching colleges with strong programs in these areas, and several schools had already expressed interest in her unique combination of academic achievement and real-world experience with anti-bullying advocacy. The start of senior year brought a bittersweet awareness that her time at Lincoln Valley was coming to an end. The school that had once felt like a prison had become a place where she discovered her own capabilities and formed lasting friendships. She'd been elected student body president in a landslide victory, running on a platform of inclusive leadership and continued expansion of the conflict resolution program. Ashley Parker had graduated the previous spring and was attending a community college in Columbus, studying social work with plans to eventually transfer to a 4-year university. She'd written Emma a letter over the summer, thanking her for the example she'd set, and explaining how their confrontation had ultimately led her to discover her own calling in helping others. I know this sounds weird coming from me, Ashley had written, but that day when you threw me across the hallway was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to confront who I was becoming and gave me the chance to choose a different path. I hope someday I can help other kids the way you helped me, even though you probably didn't realize you were doing it at the time." Emma had kept the letter, rereading it occasionally, when she needed reminding that even difficult experiences could lead to positive outcomes for everyone involved. It had reinforced her belief that strength should be used to build people up rather than tear them down, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for someone was to show them the consequences of their actions. As the autumn leaves began to fall around Lincoln Valley High School once again, Emma found herself walking through the same hallways where she'd once felt so powerless and afraid. The construction that had been ongoing during her junior year was finally complete, and the new gymnasium wing stood as a testament to the school's commitment to growth and improvement. The main hallway where she'd made her stand against Ashley and her crew looked exactly the same, but Emma felt completely different walking through it. The metal lockers still echoed with the sounds of student conversations, but now those conversations often included her name in positive contexts. Younger students looked up to her as a role model, and she'd made it a point to check in regularly with anyone who seemed to be struggling with social adjustment. During one of her final training sessions with her grandfather before leaving for college, Sensei Williams had presented her with a special gift, a black belt embroidered with her name and the words, "Strength through Wisdom," in both English and Japanese. It was a recognition not just of her technical skills, but of the wisdom she'd shown in applying those skills appropriately. "You came to me as a child hiding from her own power," he'd said, as he tied the belt around her waist. "You are leaving as a young woman who understands that true strength comes from knowing when to use your abilities and when to show restraint. I am proud of the person you have become." Emma had worn that belt to her high school graduation, where she'd been selected as the student speaker. Standing at the podium in the same gymnasium where she'd once been bullied, she'd looked out at her classmates and reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 4 years ago, I was a scared girl who thought that being invisible was the same thing as being safe, she'd told the assembled graduates and their families. I learned that hiding from conflict doesn't make it go away, it just gives other people permission to define who you are. But I also learned that standing up for yourself doesn't mean becoming the kind of person who looks for fights. It means becoming the kind of person who chooses their battles wisely and fights them with honor. The speech had been interrupted several times by applause, and Emma had noticed tears in the eyes of some audience members who knew her story. When she'd finished speaking and returned to her seat, Tyler Jackson had leaned over to whisper, "Remember when you used to eat lunch alone in the library? Look at you now." Emma had smiled at the reminder of how far she'd come. The quiet girl who'd once hidden behind mystery novels had found her voice and learned to use it effectively. The victim who'd endured weeks of harassment had become an advocate for others facing similar struggles. The student who'd felt powerless against social hierarchies had learned to navigate and ultimately change those systems. As she'd walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Emma had caught sight of her grandfather in the audience, his proud smile visible even from a distance. She'd thought about all the lessons he'd taught her, not just about judo techniques, but about character and integrity and the responsibility that came with having the power to protect yourself and others. The summer after graduation had been filled with preparation for college and reflection on her high school experience. Emma had been accepted to her first-choice university with a full scholarship based on both her academic achievements and her community service work. She'd also been invited to join a special program for students interested in conflict resolution and peer mediation. Before leaving for college, Emma had returned to Lincoln Valley one final time to speak to the incoming freshman class about bullying prevention and the importance of seeking help when needed. Standing in the auditorium where she'd once felt so small and powerless, she'd looked out at the sea of nervous 14-year-olds and remembered her own first day at the school. "Some of you are probably feeling scared right now," she'd told them. "High school can be intimidating, and it's normal to worry about fitting in and finding your place. But I want you to remember that you don't have to become someone else to be accepted here. The best friendships are the ones where people like you for who you really are, not for who you pretend to be." She'd shared some of her story, emphasizing the importance of telling trusted adults when problems arose and reminding the students that seeking help was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. Several students had approached her afterward with questions and concerns, and Emma had made sure to connect them with the current peer mediators and counselors who could provide ongoing support. As she'd driven away from Lincoln Valley High School for the last time, Emma had felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything she'd experienced there, both good and bad. The bullying and harassment had been genuinely traumatic, but they'd also forced her to discover reserves of strength and courage she hadn't known she possessed. The friendship she'd formed and the advocacy work she'd begun had given her a sense of purpose that would guide her for years to come. Now, as she prepared to start her freshman year of college, Emma carried with her the confidence that came from having faced her fears and emerged stronger. She'd learned that being quiet didn't mean being weak, that strength could be expressed through restraint as well as action, and that the most powerful victories were often the ones that lifted others up rather than tearing them down. Her grandfather's teachings about judo had proven to be about much more than martial arts techniques. They were lessons about life, about character, and about the responsibility that came with having the ability to protect yourself and others. Emma knew that whatever challenges lay ahead in college and beyond, she was prepared to meet them with the same combination of wisdom and strength that had served her so well at Lincoln Valley High School. The quiet girl who'd once been shoved into lockers had discovered that her real power lay not in her ability to throw bullies across hallways, but in her capacity to transform conflict into understanding, fear into courage, and isolation into community. It was a lesson that would stay with her long after the bruises had faded and the high school drama had become a distant memory. As Emma looked toward her future, she knew that the skills she'd developed at Lincoln Valley would serve her well in whatever career she chose to pursue. Whether she became a counselor, a teacher, a social worker, or something else entirely, she would always carry with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not with fists, but with wisdom, compassion, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are. 5 years had passed since Emma Rodriguez first walked through the doors of Lincoln Valley High School as a frightened transfer student, and now she was returning as Dr. Emma Rodriguez, having just completed her doctorate in adolescent psychology with a specialization in conflict resolution and trauma recovery. The young woman who stepped out of her car in the visitor parking lot bore little resemblance to the shy 16-year-old who had once eaten lunch alone in the library, but the core of quiet strength that had always defined her remained unchanged. The invitation to return to Lincoln Valley as the keynote speaker for their inaugural Courage and Character Symposium had come at the perfect time. Emma had just accepted a position as the Director of Youth Services at a prestigious counseling center in Chicago, but before beginning that new chapter of her life, she wanted to return to the place where she'd first discovered her own voice and power. The school itself had undergone significant changes since her graduation. The building had been renovated with modern security systems and updated classrooms, but more importantly, the culture had shifted dramatically. What had once been a place where social hierarchies ruled through fear and intimidation had become a model for inclusive education and proactive bullying prevention. The conflict resolution program that Emma had helped establish as a student had grown into a comprehensive system that was now being studied and replicated by school districts across the country. Principal Davis, now nearing retirement, greeted Emma in the main office with the warm smile of someone who had watched a troubled student grow into an accomplished professional. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, emphasizing her new title with obvious pride, "welcome back to Lincoln Valley. I have to tell you, this place hasn't been the same since you left. And I mean that in the best possible way." Emma laughed, remembering the serious, sometimes stern administrator who had handled her disciplinary hearing all those years ago. "It's good to be back, Principal Davis. Though I have to admit, it feels strange being here as an adult rather than a student." "Well, you certainly made an impression as a student," he replied. "Your story has become something of a legend here. We use it in our new student orientation to show kids that everyone has the potential to create positive change, even when things seem hopeless." As they walked through the familiar hallways, Emma was struck by the differences in atmosphere. Students moved through the corridors with a sense of ease and belonging that she remembered envying during her early days at Lincoln Valley. There were still distinct social groups, but the rigid hierarchies and climate of fear that had once characterized the school were nowhere to be seen. They passed the spot where her locker had been vandalized, now occupied by a display case showcasing student achievements in academics, arts, and community service. The hallway where she'd made her dramatic stand against Ashley and her crew was now decorated with murals created by students, depicting themes of unity, respect, and personal growth. "The conflict resolution program you helped start has been our most successful intervention," Principal Davis explained as they toured the renovated guidance counselor suite. "We've gone from having multiple serious incidents each month to maybe 1 or 2 per year. More importantly, Students are learning to handle disagreements and social conflicts before they escalate to harassment or violence. Emma felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her painful experiences had contributed to creating a safer environment for the students who came after her. The shy girl who had once suffered in silence had somehow managed to break a cycle of bullying that might have continued for years without intervention. Their tour was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Kim, the current director of student services, and a woman about Emma's age, who radiated the kind of confident competence that Emma had learned to recognize in effective advocates. "Dr. Rodriguez," Sarah said, extending her hand with a genuine smile, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your work on adolescent conflict resolution has been incredibly influential in my field." Emma shook her hand, pleased to meet someone who clearly understood the complexities of teenage social dynamics. "Thank you, Ms. Kim. I understand you've done remarkable work here in implementing comprehensive anti-bullying programs." "I had good groundwork to build on," Sarah replied. "The student-led initiatives that were started during your time here created a foundation that made systematic change possible. We've been able to expand those programs into a district-wide model that's now being used as a template for other school systems." As they continued their conversation, Emma learned that Lincoln Valley had become something of a research site for educators studying effective bullying prevention. The school's transformation from a place where harassment was commonplace to one where it was virtually non-existent had attracted attention from academics and policymakers across the country. The key insight, Sarah explained, was understanding that bullying isn't just individual bad behavior, it's a systemic problem that requires cultural change. Your story showed us that even victims can become agents of that change if they're given the right support and opportunities. Emma was introduced to several current students who served as peer mediators and conflict resolution specialists. These young people, ranging from sophomores to seniors, had been trained in many of the same techniques that Emma had learned during her graduate studies. They spoke with confidence about their role in creating a positive school culture and their commitment to ensuring that no student felt isolated or targeted. One of the peer mediators, a junior named Alex Thompson, approached Emma with obvious nervousness but genuine enthusiasm. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, his voice slightly shaky with excitement, "I've read about your research on bystander intervention and victim empowerment. I was wondering if you could tell us about how you first realized that you had the power to change your situation." Emma smiled at the earnest young man, remembering her own struggles with finding her voice and place in the complex social ecosystem of high school. "That's a great question, Alex. I think the turning point came when I realized that trying to make myself invisible wasn't actually protecting me, it was just making me an easier target. Sometimes the safest thing you can do is to stand up for yourself, even when it feels scary. But how did you know when it was time to stop trying to avoid conflict and start confronting it directly?" asked another student, a senior named Maya Patel, who wore the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worth. "I think it was when I realized that my silence was enabling the bullying to continue, not just for me, but potentially for other students as well," Emma replied thoughtfully. "My grandfather always taught me that with power comes responsibility, and once I understood that I had the ability to defend myself, I also understood that I had a responsibility to use that ability when necessary." The conversation with the students continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from conflict de-escalation techniques to the importance of adult support systems. Emma was impressed by their sophistication and genuine commitment to creating positive change in their school community. These young people understood that preventing bullying was everyone's responsibility, not just the job of teachers and administrators. Later that afternoon, Emma had the opportunity to visit her grandfather's dojo, which had expanded significantly since her high school days. Sensei Williams, now in his 70s but still moving with the grace and precision that had made him a champion, welcomed her with the quiet pride that had always characterized their relationship. "Emma," he said, bowing formally before embracing her warmly, "you honor our family and our art with your achievements. I have followed your career with great interest and even greater pride." The dojo now served not just as a martial arts training facility but as a community center, offering programs for at-risk youth, conflict resolution workshops, and therapeutic interventions for young people dealing with trauma and social difficulties. Emma's story had become part of the dojo's founding philosophy, demonstrating how martial arts training could be used not to create fighters, but to build character and confidence. "Your example has inspired many young people," Sensei Williams explained as they walked through the expanded facility. "We now have students who come here not because they want to learn how to fight, but because they want to learn how to avoid fighting while still maintaining their dignity and safety." Emma met several of the current students, including a few who had transferred to Lincoln Valley from other schools, specifically because of its reputation for inclusive, supportive culture. One girl, a sophomore named Jessica Martinez, shared her story of moving from a school where she had been relentlessly bullied for her learning differences to Lincoln Valley, where those same differences were accommodated and even celebrated. "I heard about your story from my older cousin," Jessica told Emma. "She said that you proved that being different doesn't make you weak, it just makes you unique. When I was having trouble at my old school, she told me that if Emma Rodriguez could turn things around at Lincoln Valley, maybe I could too." These conversations reinforced Emma's understanding of how individual acts of courage could ripple outward to create broader cultural change. Her willingness to stand up for herself had not only ended her own victimization, but had contributed to creating an environment where other vulnerable students could thrive. The symposium itself was held in the school's new auditorium, a state-of-the-art facility that could accommodate the entire student body, plus community members and visiting educators. Emma's keynote address was part of a day-long program featuring workshops on empathy building, conflict resolution, and bystander intervention. As she prepared for her speech, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl who had once hidden behind mystery novels in the library had become a respected professional whose research and advocacy were making a difference in the lives of young people across the country. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, but it had been profound and lasting. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty," Principal Davis announced from the podium, "it is my great honor to introduce someone who exemplifies the courage and character we celebrate today. Dr. Emma Rodriguez graduated from Lincoln Valley 8 years ago, but her impact on our school community continues to this day. She has since earned her doctorate in adolescent psychology and has become a leading voice in the field of youth conflict resolution. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Emma Rodriguez." Emma approached the podium with the same focused calm that had served her well during that long-ago confrontation in the hallway. Looking out at the assembled audience, she saw faces that reflected the diversity and inclusivity that Lincoln Valley had worked so hard to achieve. There were students of all backgrounds and social groups, teachers and administrators who clearly cared about their work, parents and community members who were invested in creating positive outcomes for young people. 8 years ago, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "I stood in a hallway not far from here and made a choice that changed my life forever. I was tired of being afraid, tired of being a victim, and tired of watching other people control my experience at this school. So I decided to take back my power." She went on to share her story, not as a tale of triumph over adversity, but as an example of how ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they found the courage to act according to their values. She spoke about the importance of seeking help from trusted adults, the value of building supportive relationships with peers, and the responsibility that came with having the ability to protect yourself and others. "The techniques my grandfather taught me weren't just about physical self-defense," Emma explained. "They were about mental discipline, emotional regulation, and ethical decision-making. The most important lesson I learned wasn't how to throw someone across a hallway. It was how to recognize when throwing someone across a hallway was the right thing to do." The audience laughed at this, but Emma could see that they understood the deeper point she was making. True strength wasn't about the ability to dominate others, but about the wisdom to know when and how to use your capabilities in service of justice and protection. "I want to be clear about something," Emma continued. "I don't advocate for violence, and I don't believe that physical confrontation should be anyone's first response to bullying or harassment. But I also don't believe that victims should be expected to endure abuse in the name of taking the high road. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is to show a bully that their behavior has consequences." She spoke about her graduate research on bystander intervention and the importance of creating school cultures where students felt empowered to speak up when they witnessed unfair treatment. She discussed the role that adults played in either enabling or preventing harassment, and the responsibility that institutions had to create clear policies and consistent enforcement. Change doesn't happen because one person stands up to one bully, Emma said as she neared the end of her address. Change happens when that one act of courage inspires others to examine their own behavior and make different choices. Change happens when victims realize they don't have to accept victimization, when bystanders decide to become advocates, and when institutions commit to creating cultures of respect and inclusion. The applause that followed her speech was sustained and enthusiastic, but Emma was more moved by the expressions on the faces in the audience. She could see students sitting straighter in their seats, teachers nodding with recognition and understanding, and parents looking at their children with new appreciation for the challenges and opportunities they faced. After her formal presentation, Emma participated in a panel discussion with other speakers, including a former gang member who now worked in violence prevention, a cyberbullying expert who helped young people navigate online harassment, and a researcher who studied the long-term effects of childhood trauma. The conversation was rich and complex, touching on everything from the role of social media in modern bullying to the importance of restorative justice approaches in addressing harmful behavior. During the question and answer session, a current Lincoln Valley student asked Emma about her advice for young people who felt powerless in the face of social challenges that seemed overwhelming. How do you find the courage to stand up for yourself when you feel like you're completely alone? Emma considered the question carefully before responding. I think the first step is recognizing that you're probably not as alone as you feel. There are adults in your life who care about your well-being, even if they don't always know how to show it effectively. There are other students who share your values and concerns, even if they haven't found the courage to speak up yet. And there are resources and support systems available, even if you haven't discovered them yet. She paused, remembering her own feelings of isolation during those difficult early months at Lincoln Valley. But beyond that, I think you have to start by standing up for yourself in small ways. You don't have to dramatically confront your biggest problems all at once. You can begin by setting small boundaries, speaking up in low-stakes situations, and gradually building the confidence and skills you need to handle bigger challenges. Another student asked about her grandfather's role in her development, and whether young people without access to martial arts training could still develop the kind of inner strength that had served Emma so well. My grandfather's specific techniques were helpful, Emma replied, but the real lessons were about discipline, respect, and understanding your own capabilities. You can develop those qualities through many different activities: sports, music, art, academic achievement, volunteer work, or any pursuit that requires you to push yourself beyond your comfort zone and work toward mastery. As the symposium concluded and attendees began to disperse, Emma was approached by numerous students, parents, and educators who wanted to continue the conversation. She exchanged contact information with several young people who were interested in pursuing careers in counseling or conflict resolution, and she provided resources for parents who were dealing with bullying situations in their own children's schools. One conversation that particularly stood out was with a girl named Sarah Collins, a freshman who had recently transferred to Lincoln Valley from a school where she had been severely bullied. "Dr. Rodriguez," Sarah said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you for showing me that it's possible to recover from being bullied. I was starting to think that there was something wrong with me, that maybe I deserved what was happening." Emma felt her heart clench with recognition and compassion. "Sarah, there is absolutely nothing wrong with you, and you never deserve to be treated badly. The fact that you had the courage to ask for a transfer shows that you're already advocating for yourself. That's exactly the kind of strength that will serve you well going forward." They talked for several more minutes about strategies for building new friendships, techniques for handling social anxiety, and resources available through the school's counseling program. As Sarah walked away with her parents, Emma reflected on how different this girl's experience would be compared to her own 8 years earlier. Sarah was entering a school with established support systems, clear anti-bullying policies, and a culture that valued inclusion and respect. The work that Emma and others had done was already making a tangible difference in young people's lives. Later that evening, Emma joined her grandfather for dinner at their favorite restaurant in downtown Cedar Falls. Over bowls of pho and cups of green tea, they reflected on the day's events and the journey that had brought them to this point. "I am proud of what you have accomplished," Sensei Williams said, his eyes warm with affection and admiration. "But I am even more proud of who you have become. You have taken the lessons of judo and applied them to the larger world, using your strength in service of others, rather than for personal gain. Emma smiled at her grandfather, thinking about all the ways his teachings had shaped not just her response to that long-ago crisis, but her entire approach to life and work. "You taught me that true power comes from knowing when and how to use your abilities," she replied. "Everything I've accomplished is built on that foundation." As they continued their conversation, Emma realized that her story wasn't really about a bullied student who fought back, but about a young person who discovered her own agency and used it to create positive change. The judo techniques had been important in that crucial moment, but the real transformation had been internal. The shift from victim mentality to empowered advocacy. The next morning, before leaving Cedar Falls to return to Chicago and begin her new position, Emma made one final stop at Lincoln Valley High School. She wanted to walk through the hallways one more time, to see the place where she'd experienced some of her darkest moments, but also discovered her greatest strengths. The building was quiet in the early morning hours, with only a few staff members and early arriving students moving through the corridors. Emma made her way to the main hallway where her confrontation with Ashley and her crew had taken place, standing in the exact spot where she'd made the choice to stop being a victim. The hallway looked completely ordinary in the morning light, just another corridor in a typical high school. But for Emma, it would always be the place where she'd learned that she had the power to change her circumstances, if she was willing to accept the risks and responsibilities that came with that power. As she stood there remembering, a young teacher approached her with a friendly smile. "Are you Dr. Rodriguez?" the teacher asked. "I'm Ms. Patterson. I teach freshman English. I just wanted to thank you for yesterday's presentation. It really resonated with my students, especially the ones who are still figuring out how to navigate high school social dynamics." Emma smiled at the enthusiastic young educator, recognizing in her the kind of adult ally she herself had needed during her difficult early months at Lincoln Valley. "Thank you, Ms. Patterson. It means a lot to know that the message is reaching students who can benefit from it." They chatted briefly about strategies for supporting vulnerable students and the importance of creating classroom environments where every student felt valued and heard. As they talked, Emma realized that this conversation represented something significant. A teacher who understood her role in preventing bullying and was actively working to create positive outcomes for her students. As Emma finally left Lincoln Valley High School for what might be the last time, she carried with her a profound sense of completion. The frightened girl who had first walked through those doors had grown into a confident woman whose work was making a real difference in the world. The victim had become an advocate, the student had become a teacher, and the person who had once felt powerless had discovered how to help others find their own strength. Driving back toward Chicago in her new life, Emma reflected on the ripple effects of that single moment of courage 8 years earlier. Her willingness to stand up for herself had not only ended her own victimization, but had contributed to transforming an entire school culture. Students who had never met her were benefiting from programs and policies that grew out of her experience. Young people across the country were learning conflict resolution skills based on research that she had conducted. The quiet girl who had once been shoved into lockers had discovered that her real power lay not in her judo techniques, but in her ability to transform personal pain into systemic change. She had learned that true strength came not from the ability to defeat your enemies, but from the wisdom to turn enemies into allies and trauma into advocacy. As the familiar landscapes of Cedar Falls faded in her rearview mirror, Emma looked toward a future filled with possibility and purpose. She was ready to take everything she had learned about courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right, and use it to help the next generation of young people discover their own strength and voice. The story that had begun with a frightened transfer student eating lunch alone in a library was continuing with a confident professional dedicated to ensuring that no young person would have to face their challenges without support, resources, and the knowledge that they had the power to create positive change in their own lives and communities. 10 years had elapsed since Emma Rodriguez first discovered her inner strength in the hallways of Lincoln Valley High School, and now she found herself standing before the United States Congress as they debated the National Youth Safety and Empowerment Act. The legislation, which she had helped draft during her tenure as director of the National Center for Adolescent Conflict Resolution, would provide federal funding for comprehensive anti-bullying programs in schools across America. The woman addressing the congressional subcommittee bore the quiet confidence that had always been her trademark, but now it was amplified by years of experience helping thousands of young people navigate the treacherous waters of adolescent social dynamics. Her research had been cited in academic journals worldwide, her intervention programs had been implemented in over 200 school districts, and her book, Finding Your Voice, A Guide to Empowerment for Young People, had become required reading in education programs across the country. "Honorable representatives," Emma began, her voice carrying the same steady authority that had once silenced a hostile high school hallway. "Bullying is not a rite of passage or a normal part of growing up. It is a systematic abuse of power that destroys lives, derails futures, and perpetuates cycles of violence that can last for generations. But it is also entirely preventable when we have the courage to implement evidence-based solutions." As she presented her testimony, supported by decades of research and real-world implementation data, Emma reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The shy teenager who had once eaten lunch alone in a library was now influencing national policy on youth safety and empowerment. The victim who had endured weeks of harassment was now the leading expert on transforming school cultures to prevent such experiences for future generations. Her presentation included video testimonials from students, teachers, and administrators in schools that had implemented her programs. A young boy from Detroit spoke about how peer mediation training had helped him resolve conflicts without violence. A teacher from rural Montana explained how conflict resolution education had reduced suspensions in her school by 80%. A principal from inner-city Los Angeles described how creating cultures of inclusion and empowerment had transformed his campus from a place of fear into a center of learning and growth. "The evidence is overwhelming," Emma continued, clicking to her next slide, which showed statistical analyses from multiple longitudinal studies. "Schools that implement comprehensive empowerment and conflict resolution programs see dramatic reductions in bullying incidents, improved academic outcomes, better mental health indicators among students, and decreased teacher turnover. But more importantly, they produce young people who understand that they have the power to create positive change in their communities." Congressman Williams from Ohio, a veteran legislator known for his skepticism of federal education initiatives, leaned forward in his chair. "Dr. Rodriguez, these programs sound promising in theory, but how do we know they'll work in practice across diverse communities with different cultural values and resource limitations?" Emma had anticipated this question, having heard variations of it countless times during her advocacy work. "Congressman Williams, that's an excellent point, and it's exactly why our pilot programs were deliberately implemented in communities with vastly different demographics, resource levels, and cultural contexts. From wealthy suburban districts to struggling rural schools to urban centers facing complex social challenges, the core principles of empowerment and conflict resolution prove effective when adapted to local contexts." She clicked to a map showing the locations of successful program implementations, each marked with outcome data. In Montana's Glacier County, where we worked with Native American communities, the program reduced bullying incidents by 72% while also improving cultural pride and intergenerational communication. In Miami-Dade County, where we implemented bilingual programming for predominantly Hispanic populations, academic achievement improved alongside social outcomes. The beauty of these approaches is that they strengthen rather than replace existing cultural values around respect, community, and personal responsibility. The questions continued for over an hour, with representatives probing everything from cost-effectiveness to implementation timelines to potential unintended consequences. Emma answered each inquiry with the thorough preparation and passionate conviction that had made her one of the most respected voices in her field. Following her congressional testimony, Emma was approached by Dr. Patricia Chen, the Secretary of Education, who had been observing the proceedings from the gallery. "Dr. Rodriguez," Secretary Chen said as they walked through the marble corridors of the Capitol building, "your presentation was compelling, but I'm curious about something more personal. What drives this level of commitment to youth advocacy? This clearly goes beyond professional interest." Emma paused, considering how much of her personal story to share with one of the most powerful education officials in the country. "Madam Secretary, I was once a student who felt completely powerless in the face of systematic harassment. I know what it feels like to dread going to school, to eat lunch alone because other students are afraid to associate with you, to have your belongings destroyed and your dignity attacked on a daily basis." Secretary Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And that experience motivates your current work?" "That experience taught me that young people have far more power than they realize, but they need adults who understand how to help them access and develop that power responsibly," Emma replied. "Every student deserves to feel safe, valued, and empowered in their educational environment." When we fail to provide that, we're not just failing individual children, we're failing our entire society. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma's longtime collaborator and friend, Dr. Marcus Thompson, who had flown in from California to provide additional technical testimony about program implementation. Marcus, a former gang member turned PhD who specialized in violence prevention, had worked with Emma for 5 years to develop intervention strategies for high-risk youth populations. Emma, Marcus said with the easy familiarity of a trusted colleague, the Youth Advocacy Coalition is meeting tonight to discuss strategy for the Senate hearings next week. They're particularly interested in your ideas about integrating trauma-informed practices with traditional conflict resolution approaches. As they made their way toward the meeting, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source. Ashley Parker, now Dr. Ashley Parker, and director of a nonprofit organization focused on rehabilitation for former bullies, was congratulating her on the congressional testimony and sharing news about her own recent success in securing funding for restorative justice programs in juvenile detention facilities. The message brought a smile to Emma's face as she remembered their final conversation in that park near Lincoln Valley High School all those years ago. Ashley's transformation from cruel teenager to dedicated advocate had been one of the most remarkable aspects of Emma's own journey. Their unlikely collaboration on several research projects had produced groundbreaking insights into the psychology of bullying behavior and the potential for redemption and positive change. You know, Ashley had written in a recent email, I sometimes think about how different both our lives would be if you hadn't found the courage to stand up to me that day. I might still be hurting people, and you might still be hiding in libraries. It's amazing how one moment of bravery can change everything. The Youth Advocacy Coalition meeting was held in a conference room near the Capitol, bringing together representatives from dozens of organizations focused on everything from cyberbullying prevention to LGBTQ+ youth safety to special needs advocacy. Emma was struck by the diversity of perspectives and approaches represented in the room, but also by the shared commitment to protecting and empowering young people. During the strategy session, a representative from the National Association of Secondary School Principals raised concerns about implementation challenges in schools with limited resources and high teacher turnover. Dr. Rodriguez, Principal Martinez from Phoenix, said, "Your research shows impressive results, but many of our schools are barely keeping their heads above water with basic educational requirements. How do we convince administrators that they have time and energy for additional programming?" Emma had heard this concern countless times, and she'd learned that the most effective response came from reframing the question entirely. Principal Martinez, I understand the resource constraints that schools face, but I'd argue that these programs don't add to administrative burden, they reduce it. Schools that implement comprehensive conflict resolution and empowerment programs see dramatic decreases in disciplinary incidents, fewer crisis interventions, reduced liability issues, and improved teacher satisfaction and retention. She pulled out her tablet to show real-world data from similar schools. Lincoln High School in Portland had 12 serious violent incidents in the year before implementation. In the 3 years since, they've had 0. Jefferson Middle School in Birmingham reduced their suspension rate by 68%, while improving standardized test scores across all demographic groups. These aren't just feel-good stories, they're practical solutions to problems that are already consuming enormous amounts of administrative time and resources. The discussion continued late into the evening, with participants sharing success stories, implementation challenges, and creative solutions they'd developed in their own communities. Emma was particularly inspired by Maria Gonzalez, a school social worker from El Paso who had adapted Emma's peer mediation model to work with recent immigrant students facing language barriers and cultural adjustment challenges. We discovered that empowerment looks different across cultures, Maria explained, but the fundamental human need to feel valued and capable is universal. When we helped our immigrant students understand that their multilingual abilities and cross-cultural perspectives were strengths rather than deficits, their confidence improved dramatically. They went from being targets of harassment to becoming cultural ambassadors and peer mediators themselves. As the meeting concluded and participants began to disperse, Emma found herself in conversation with a group of current high school students who had been invited to provide youth perspectives on the proposed legislation. These young people, representing schools from across the country, spoke with a sophistication and passion that reminded Emma of her own transformation from victim to advocate. One student, a junior named David Kim from Seattle, approached Emma with obvious nervousness but clear determination. "Dr. Rodriguez, I wanted to thank you for your work. but I also wanted to ask your advice about something. I'm dealing with a situation at my school where there's systematic harassment of students with disabilities, and the administration seems either unable or unwilling to address it effectively. Emma felt a familiar tightening in her chest, recognizing the frustration and sense of powerlessness in David's voice. Tell me more about what you're seeing, David. What specific behaviors are occurring, and what responses have you tried so far? As David described the situation, Emma was struck by how similar his experiences were to her own all those years ago, but also by how much more sophisticated his understanding of the problem was. This young man understood systems and power dynamics in ways that had taken her years to develop. He was already thinking strategically about documentation, adult allies, and systemic solutions rather than just hoping the problem would go away. "The first thing I want you to know," Emma told him, "is that your instinct to seek help and advocate for change is exactly right. You're not powerless in this situation, even though it may feel that way sometimes. But you also don't have to handle this alone." They spent nearly 30 minutes discussing specific strategies, from documenting incidents to building coalitions of concerned students and parents, to approaching media attention as a last resort. Emma provided David with contact information for several national organizations that could provide additional support and resources, and she promised to follow up with him in a few weeks to see how his efforts were progressing. The conversation reminded Emma of why her work mattered on such a personal level. Every young person facing harassment deserved to have the tools and support that she'd eventually found, but they deserved to have them much sooner, and without having to figure everything out through painful trial and error. Later that week, Emma returned to Chicago to find her office at the National Center, flooded with emails and calls from educators, parents, and students who had seen coverage of her congressional testimony. The response was overwhelming, with requests for training programs, consultation services, and speaking engagements coming from every region of the country. One email that particularly caught her attention came from Tyler Jackson, her old friend from Lincoln Valley who was now a teacher himself. "Emma," he wrote, "I've been following your career with such pride and admiration. You've become exactly the person I always knew you could be. I'm now teaching at a middle school in Indianapolis, and I'm implementing some of the strategies you've developed. The results have been incredible. Thank you for showing all of us that we have the power to create change." As Emma read through the dozens of similar messages, she was struck by the realization that her story had become much larger than her personal journey from victim to advocate. It had become a symbol of possibility for countless young people who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The quiet girl who had once hidden behind mystery novels had become a voice for the voiceless, a defender of the vulnerable, and a proof of concept that individual courage could create systematic change. That evening, Emma received a call from her grandfather, now 82 but still teaching at his expanded dojo in Cedar Falls. "Emma," Sensei Williams said, his voice warm with pride and affection, "I saw your testimony on the news today. You have taken the principles of judo further than I ever imagined possible." "I learned from the best teacher," Emma replied, feeling the same deep gratitude and respect for her grandfather that had sustained her through all the challenging years of growth and development. "You learned the techniques from me," he corrected gently, "but you developed the wisdom to apply them to challenges I never could have anticipated. You have shown that true martial arts mastery isn't about defeating opponents in competition, but about using your strength to protect and empower others." As they continued their conversation, Emma reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from that terrified teenager in a high school hallway to a nationally recognized expert influencing federal policy. The path hadn't been straight or simple, but every challenge had contributed to her understanding of how power, courage, and compassion could be combined to create positive change. The National Youth Safety and Empowerment Act passed both houses of Congress 6 months later, providing federal funding for comprehensive anti-bullying and youth empowerment programs in schools across America. Emma stood in the Rose Garden as the president signed the legislation, surrounded by students, educators, and advocates who had worked tirelessly to make this moment possible. In her remarks at the signing ceremony, Emma chose to focus not on her own journey, but on the potential that existed within every young person who had ever felt powerless or afraid. "Today we're not just signing legislation," she said to the assembled crowd and television cameras. "We're making a promise to every student in America that they matter, that their safety and dignity are priorities, and that they have the power to create positive change in their own lives and communities." As the ceremony concluded and participants began to disperse, Emma found a quiet moment to text her old friend Ashley, who was watching the proceedings from her office in Los Angeles. "We did it," Emma wrote. "That scared kid hiding in the library and that angry girl looking for someone to hurt have somehow managed to change federal policy. Not bad for a couple of former high school enemies." Ashley's response came immediately. "Emma, you were never my enemy. You were my teacher, even when I was too stubborn and scared to learn the lessons you were offering. Thank you for never giving up on the possibility that people can change." Standing on the south lawn of the White House, Emma thought about all the young people across the country who would benefit from the programs and resources that this legislation would provide. Students who felt isolated would find community. Victims would discover their own power. Bystanders would learn to become advocates. And perhaps most importantly, bullies would have opportunities to understand the impact of their behavior and choose different paths forward. The quiet girl, who had once been shoved into lockers, had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in her ability to defend herself, but in her capacity to ensure that future generations of students would never have to face the same challenges alone. Through research, advocacy, policy development, and direct service, she had transformed personal trauma into systematic change that would protect countless young people for decades to come. As Emma looked toward the future, she knew that her work was far from finished. There would always be new challenges to address, new populations to serve, and new opportunities to expand the reach and impact of youth empowerment programs. But she also knew that she had built something lasting, something that would continue to grow and evolve long after her own direct involvement ended. The scared teenager eating lunch alone in a library had become a voice for millions of young people who needed to know that they mattered, that they had power, and that they could create change. It was a transformation that had begun with a single moment of courage in a high school hallway, but it had become something much larger than any individual story. It had become proof that with the right support, every young person has the potential to become an agent of positive change in the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.